G'day everyone and welcome back to the Pokestraya YouTube channel. It's Jordan here and I'm joined by a very special guest, the 2016 Australian National Champion, Jordan Palmer. How are you today?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me, Jordan.
No worries, it's a pleasure to have you. We're going to be talking today about the tier list that we've put together for the standard format for 2017, 2016-17 format. But before we get into that, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and talk about last season and a couple of other things, whatever you feel like talking about.
No problem. So yeah, as you said, I'm the 2016 Australian National Champion. Last year I played mainly Seismitoad Crobat deck for the regionals run. I won 3 regionals in a row with that. And then I switched to Eveltal for the national championships and also for the world championships last year.
Alright, and you did decent at Worlds. Not the
Yeah, not
best,
too
but
bad.
it
Finished
wasn't.
in 57th.
Yeah,
Not
57th.
my worst performance, that's for
Alright, so we're going to talk today about a tier list that you and I put together just before.
Yep.
We've got a couple of different decks here, and we're going to go over a couple of matchups and just talk about the decks and break them down a little bit. So we'll jump straight into that. So this is the current format. We do have evolutions coming out November sometime.
Yeah.
So the first big event is London, which starts at the 9th of December. So evolutions will be legal for that. But we don't think that evolutions changes too much of the format. Can we agree to that? It doesn't.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a couple of decks that kind of maybe get a bit better, change a little bit, but we'll talk about that at the end. So we get started here with Tier 2. So Tier 3 I don't think is worth mentioning anything that's that low down. There's a lot of decks here actually. So Tier 2, we've got Greninja, Darkrai Giratina, Vileplume Box, Xerneas Giratina, and Mega Rayquaza. So we're just going to go through these and kind of talk about why we made the choices we did and just talk about the decks. So you can take it away. Talking about Greninja here.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on Greninja and why is it lower down despite winning a regionals in the US?
Yeah, true. Although that was
expanded, yeah.
But I don't think too much changes between Greninja and standard and expanded anyway.
Yeah, there's a couple of cards, but not many.
Yeah, pretty much. Greninja's biggest weakness is just that it draws terribly, to be honest. It's just...
Yeah.
Even with Talonflame, you can either open Talonflame and... Even then, it kind of slows your setup down because it's like one extra turn you might not be using water duplicates if you attack with Variants. Or if you don't open with it, then your deck's even less consistent than if you didn't play it at all.
Yeah.
So, like, even if it wasn't too inconsistent, like even if it drew well, it still has to deal with the fact that Garbagore's in the format and there's no tool removal. So that instantly gives it a lot of bad matchups and makes it really easy deck to tech for.
Yeah.
However, it is probably the strongest non-EX attacker in the game with 170 HP, free retreat, low energy cost, and the amazing ability to snipe damage anywhere.
Yeah.
It's definitely like not something to discount. If it sets up, it's probably going to beat you most of the time.
Yeah, it's definitely a strong Pokemon. 170 HP is a lot for a non-EX. It's okay when there's EX Pokemon that are 170 because you do get the reward of 2 prizes taking that out, but when it's only a 1 prize card, it's a little frustrating to play against.
Yeah, definitely.
But as you said, with the Talonflame, the deck does gain a bit more consistency, but I think even like with cards like N in the format as well, those cards do go to your hand. So if you don't get a Froakie down on that first turn and you try and get it with the Talonflame, you can still get End out of those Froakies. And then if you miss them again, then you just fall too far behind. And Greninja Break is like essentially a stage 3 Pokemon. Water duplicates helps a lot, which is like the only reason why the deck's even considered is because of water duplicates. But yeah, I think it's a very, very strong card and a very strong deck. It's just way too inconsistent.
I think that if it drew better than what it does, or if it was more consistent, it would definitely be tier 1 or 1.5, just because it doesn't really have that much that can stop it once it sets up. Like, it has no energy attack, so stuff like Eveltal and Mewtwo can't even touch it.
Yeah, like it takes like crazy amounts of energy on a Mewtwo or Yveltal to knock one out. So that's Greninja. I don't think there's too much else we can talk about Greninja. A very strong deck and strong card. just too inconsistent to be considered tier one. If there was a way to make the deck super consistent and get like Greninja Breakout as soon as possible, then I'd consider it to move up higher. But I just think,
I think that it would probably move to at least a tier 1.5 if
yeah, I don't think
consistent
it would be
full
tier
removal.
one. Um,
Like if it can deal with Garbodor, I think it's definitely
yeah,
fits in tier 5 at the very least. But at
yeah.
the moment, there's nothing for
You
it.
just lose to Garbodor. There's nothing you can do about it. Like,
Lysander it twice, I guess.
yeah, Lysander twice is like the only way to deal with it. Then you've like wasted 2 turns to get one prize,
Yeah.
and if they're playing like a 2-2 line, they'll just set another one up, and you got to do it all over again.
Yeah.
Next up,
To be fair, if they do get a slow Garbodor, if they get a slow Garbodor set up, you can actually just snipe it on the bench pretty easily.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
if they don't get a Tropish.
If you're able to set up before
I
they
guess
can set a
it does.
Garb up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dark Red
Anyway,
Giratina.
next deck.
Hey.
Yep.
Yeah, Dark Red
Next
Giratina.
deck, sorry. Okay.
I think Giratina as a whole is slightly weaker just due to Rainbow Road being so big in this format.
Definitely.
And when you've got Darkrai as well, which has the Xerneas has got the resistance, so you need so many energies on it, and to hit this 120 HP Pokemon that's just going to come out and one-shot you. That's one of the biggest weaknesses I see with this deck. I think it's got definitely some good matches in the format. Obviously, Giratina can stop things like Mega Sizzle, Mega Mewtwo, Mega Rayquaza, but there is ways around that as well. So what are your thoughts on this Dark Red Giratina deck?
Well, I think Giratina has like probably one of the strongest attacks in the game, locking out special stadiums and tools. But that is also weaker now than it used to be now that Pokemon Ranger's legal, even though it's not seeing a bunch of play.
Ranger.
I mean, Ranger does make the deck weaker as a whole. Although the Giratina's main purpose, I guess, is to make Darkrai stronger with Dark Pulse.
Yeah.
And I think Darkrai Giratina has a lot of good matchups. Like, I think it handles stuff like Rayquaza really easily. But as you said, it struggles against a lot of it. Like, it's a deck that either has a good matchup or a bad matchup.
Yeah.
And too many close ones. Like, you're either going to get paired with Rayquaza and do really well, or you'll pair Rainbow Road and get destroyed. You could pair Gardevoir and get destroyed. It could be even stuff like Sizzle could be kind of close, but I guess it's a deck that only
Sizzle does
because I mean
a lot of energy disruption as well. So when you're getting rid of
but it is a deck that can run pretty well with just basic energy as well. So I think it's a deck that you could kind of go into with a specific metagame in mind, but because it's got so many really hard matchups, I think it's only tier 2 at the moment.
Yeah, and Xerneas Giratina's kind of the same.
Yeah, it's the same deck strategy, just a different, really.
Xerneas does have the added bonus that it is a non-EX attacker, which is always good. It's a break Pokemon. I guess they're just kind of the same thing, really. I don't think Xerneas or Darkrai's better in either way. I think they've both got good things about them.
Yeah, I think that the Xerneas deck does beat the Darkrai deck pretty easily, so I guess...
Yeah,
I think if I had to rate the decks, I'd rate the Xerneas one slightly higher.
Yeah. But they're both still, I think, got enough bad matchups or not good matchups in the format that put them at tier 2.
Yeah.
There's just, I think, too many better decks in the format that just kind of beat this deck at the moment, anyway. But it's still a deck that, as you said, just could go into any tournament and just like pair really luckily against like Mega Ray or something and just win the entire thing. But it does.
Yeah, definitely.
It does have a couple of bad matchups in the format. That's for both of them as well. Next we got Vileplume Box. A deck that I don't think was really talked about until Worlds. Like it was like when we talk Vileplume Box, where Vileplume, Jolteon, Glaceon, the evolutions with...
Vileplume Ninja Boy, I guess, is a good way to label it.
Yeah. So I think with a Ranger in the format, this is kind of a deck that takes a hit, although not many decks are really playing that Ranger at the moment. There's things like Volcanion always played like a one-of, and it can just kind of mess with the entire strategy. It's good if you can get a quick item lock of course, losing AZ hurts a lot as well, just because if we now have to play like multiple copies of Olympia just to make sure that Vileplume never gets stuck active, because if it does, you lose your entire lock. So what are your thoughts on this Vileplume box deck?
Yeah, I think losing AZ was honestly one of the things that really killed this
Yeah,
deck. I mean, matchups wise, it really sounds solid. Like item lock plus attack lock, I guess you could call it, really should beat just about anything, but it suffers the same inconsistency of Greninja, and it lost a lot of important cards.
yeah. And next we got Mega Rayquaza, which for tier 2, I don't think that many people were probably expecting it to come so low, especially when you're comparing it to decks like Greninja. Um, I think Mega Rayquaza definitely gets better post evolutions. Um,
100%.
I just I think when you look at some of the decks that are higher in the tier, Mega Rayquaza just kind of loses to those decks, despite being
Yeah.
probably the most consistent deck in the format. You know, like the 4 Shaman, 4 Ultra Ball, 4 Trainers Mail. You know, it's a consistent deck. I just think there's too much in the format that just kind of beat it at the moment. Parallel City is just such a good card, and a card that I've been seeing personally an increase of plays Parallel City. It doesn't completely ruin Rayquaza, but it can hurt, especially like a Parallel City Hex Maniac kind of thing, so then you can't Hoopa or anything. Then I
Yeah.
think it gets tough from there. But it's a consistent deck. I just think when you compare it to some of the decks higher up on this tier list, that it's just not as good.
Yeah, I
That's my
think it
opinion on
it
it anyway.
struggles against quite a bit actually. Like even decks like Evolta, which you'd think that it should be able to beat when you consider the fact that it has Zoroark, which can one hit it, and they've
Yeah,
got Fright Knight, which can slow you down. Then you got like Sizzle, which can deny its energy, Rainbow Road, which can trade favorably with it. There's a lot of downsides to that deck, and as you said, Parallel City is more common than ever.
yeah,
And until Dragonite EX comes out in Evolutions, it really is a big problem for this deck. I think
like
that once it gets Dragonite, it can deal with Parallel a lot better, but I think the best thing going for this deck right now isn't so much its matchups, but as you said, the pure speed, power, and consistency of that deck.
yeah, yeah,
If we were rating decks just on how well they did what they're supposed to do, Rayquaza would be tier 1 for sure.
yeah, yeah,
It's
easily.
just because of the way it matches up with the other decks that it's ranked a lot lower than I think most people would consider it right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would consider it a bit higher, especially with Karen now being legal. You still don't
Yes.
really see this deck doing too much, because even though you've got that Karen in the deck, Parallel City doesn't hurt as much, but it's still your supporter of the turn. I feel like Super Rod does it a bit better, personally. But what are your thoughts on
Overall, yeah.
Karen in the Mega Rayquaza deck? Does it help improve any matchups or anything? Like, does Karen make the deck any? Well, it clearly makes the deck better because you can recover easily from things like a Parallel City drop.
Yeah.
But it does kind of mess a bit with the consistency of the deck, in my opinion, anyway.
I think Rayquaza is probably one of the decks that can get away with Karen better than most other decks. I mean, most other decks would either just rely on super odds or not bother at all. But
Yeah,
I think Rayquaza, since you can just discard all the Shamans with Parallel City and then carry them all back in, you kind of get some of that consistency back into the deck. So it's not
yeah, that's a
entirely
fair
bad
point.
for
Yeah,
consistency.
yeah.
But
Um,
overall, it's probably not going to be a huge card. I think Super Odd still does the job okay, but it probably uses Karen better than any other deck in the
yeah,
format, which is going to make it a little.
especially with Brock's Guts and Dragonite EX coming out, I think Mega Ray will definitely get a boost then. I personally think
Dragonite EX is, I think, definitely going to
like
be the big game changer
if
for
a
that
Parallel
deck.
City comes down, you just put a Skyfield Dragonite EX and get like back a Hooper, and then just get like
Yeah,
everything back, and you can set up
pretty much.
straight away from
And
that.
Dragonite, and then to get a Hooper, and then Karen to shuffle the rest of your Pokemon back in would
Yeah,
actually be a pretty good combo. Because
yeah,
Dragonite actually gets the Pokemon back to hand, right?
yeah. It gets the Pokemon back to hand.
So yeah, using it to get like a Hooper and then using a Karen to shuffle all your Shamans in would be a pretty cool combo.
Yeah, like even I think Rock Scouts would probably be fine for the deck as well. I don't think there's too many circumstances where you really have more than like six Pokemon in the discard pile anyway. Like
Yeah,
Parallel City comes
and you
down,
don't
like
really need to shuffle energy in either.
yeah, like I think though it is nice to sometimes get those energies back if you're out of Mega Turbos or something. But
That's
it's
true.
it's definitely a deck going forward that I think's got a lot of potential. But I think as we look at it pre-evolutions, it's probably not as good as some of the other decks here.
Sounds good.
So we'll move on. So we got tier 1.5, which is kind of the middle ground between tier 2 and tier 1. So we'll we will list these decks as well and then go over them individually. So we got Mega Mewtwo, Vespiquen, Yveltal, Mega Gardevoir, and Garchomp. So a couple of interesting decks there. We'll start with the big dog, Mega Mewtwo. When we first went into this rotation, I think this was the most hyped deck. Mewtwo,
Yep.
Garbodor, or straight Mewtwo. I think both are fine. Both are pretty good. When you look at Mega Mewtwo, it's a very consistent deck and can hit for a lot of damage. I think the problem with Mega Mewtwo is that you've got other decks that just kind of don't deliberately counter it, but play cards that just kind of are better than Mewtwo and just kind of run over Mewtwo. Some of the tier 1 decks that we've got here are just kind of designed to beat Mewtwo, although they're not intended just to beat Mewtwo, but they just happen to beat Mewtwo as well. Like things like that Xerneas.
Yeah,
Can just hit
exactly.
for,
I think that
insane
Mewtwo
numbers.
Mewtwo sits into a. I think Mewtwo fits into a very similar category to Mega Rayquaza in that it's very powerful, very fast, very consistent, but it just happens to have some of those bad matchups. But I think that it doesn't have as many bad matchups as Rayquaza, which is why it's listed a little bit higher. I think that I wouldn't say it's faster, but I think it might be more consistent than Rayquaza since it needs less setup to actually be able to get those big numbers off.
Yeah.
It doesn't really get hindered too much by Parallel City. In fact, it often abuses Parallel City, and it also has that really strong damage change attack, which
damage change is
really
incredible.
slings a lot of matchups.
Yeah.
The biggest problem.
Heal damage is insane. Like
Yeah,
they do
sure.
like 170 to you, and you just get rid of it all and take 2
Using
prizes
it
for
like Lysander kill a Shaman once you've taken like 120
Yeah.
damage is just amazing. I think the biggest problem with the deck is it's pretty well, not as I said, not as easy to counter, but there are cards like that Fates Collide Mew which you can use to put into almost any deck.
I think
And
when people look at the format, they probably see Mega Mewtwo as a standout deck. So if you're not playing Mega Mewtwo, there are decks such as like Yveltal which started taking in this Mew to just kind of help with that matchup, which is fine. Mew really works with Yveltal quite well.
Yeah.
But I think...
And Yveltal also has the Fright Night ability as well, which screws you over.
I think early on into the format, people are going to be playing cards like this Mew and possibly even Mew EX, just expecting so much Mega Mewtwo. And then I think Mega Mewtwo will kind of fade out a bit and then just like pop up out of nowhere when everybody stops playing this Mew and just destroy everyone because no one's prepared for it.
That's a good observation.
Yeah. So I think the Mew is really a big problem for the deck.
Although Garbodor does counteract that.
Yeah, Garbodor does help a lot. Even Hex Maniac's fine. Garbodor in this format without tool removal's incredible. Unfortunately, there's not too many decks that really can abuse it too much. I think there's like 2 main ones, and one of those is Mega Mewtwo. That really benefits from having the Garbodor. Yeah. So next up, we got Vespiquen. I really enjoy playing Vespiquen at the moment. The reason it's tier 1.5, and we discussed this, was because that it does have the potential for any deck to play one card to counter it, and that's Karen. This deck could pretty much beat... I would say Vespiquen has potential to beat anything in the format.
Yeah.
It definitely has its bad matchups. Like Volcanions can just kind of run over it with a weakness. And there are certain things that just kind of beat Vespiquen, but I think in any circumstance it could pretty much beat anything. But just having any deck that ability to just play one of Karen and just ruin everything for you just sucks.
Yeah. What I do like about the Vespiquen deck is that there's many ways you can build it. I mean, besides Vespiquen, Klefki, and Unknown are pretty, and Shaman, of course, are pretty much standard. But
Yeah, that's the
you can choose to play like. You can choose to play like Unknown, Klefki, and Unknown, and Shaman, of course, are pretty much standard. But you can choose to play like Vespiquen, Klefki, and Unknown, and Shaman, of course, are pretty much standard. But Yeah, but you can choose to play again Mega Line. You can choose to have the Evolutions. There's Zoroark, maybe even something like a Raichu or a Zebstrika.
Yeah.
There's many other Pokemon you can play, which you can kind of target any matchup that you don't feel too confident with, which is a trait I really like about the deck. And of course, it's super fast.
Yeah, I'd agree to that. Just the room to put in any tech for whatever you feel like's a bad matchup. If you know the meta quite well and you're expecting a deck to do well, you can really tech against that with this Vespiquen deck. Uh, it's just that downside of that Karen being in the format, um, especially kind of mid to late game. If they drop that Karen, and you've got like 15 Pokemon in the discard pile, you may have burned through all of your Ultra Balls, all of your Trainers Mails,
And yeah,
and yeah, your acrobikes, and now you're not being able to discard those Pokemon as easily, and you're also just going to have a higher chance of drawing into like 15 Pokemon now for turns in a row. Um, so I think
yeah,
just the Karen just kind of ruins the deck completely if they do play that. But I think if any deck's not playing Karen, it's a scary deck to play just because like any deck can play Karen if they choose to. Um, and that's the scary thought about
100%.
playing Vespiquen. It's kind of a risky deck to play, but a very strong deck if you can get it to work.
Yeah,
Next, we've got Evil Toll. So this covers pretty much any Evil Toll build. Evil Toll Mew, Evil Toll Zoroark are the main two. Um, so let's talk about those ones. You can start us off here. Evil Toll Mew. What are your thoughts on that, and why is it 1.5?
I feel like there's not too many differences between Evil to Mew and Evil to Zoroark as
Yeah,
well. I think Yveltal is kind of more of an anti-meta deck as opposed to like a top tier deck in the sense that it's built to count. You can build it to counter specific things. Like you can choose to run it with stuff like Enhanced Hammers and Parallel Cities and Delinquents and have like a really aggressive build, or you can go for more of those like Max Elixirs and Zoroarks and all that really
yeah,
fast stuff to try and overpower your opponent. So it's very flexible in the way you can build it, and it's got quite a few decent matchups because you can really play around the Fright Knight side of the deck really well. I mean, all
yeah,
Mega decks these flanks, and most decks these days are playing Floatstone as one of the only ways to retreat. So you can kind of capitalize on your opponent's like board with Fright Knight and then set up for the rest of the game. But any deck that it's either not built to beat or just kind of overpowers it because eventually X is strong, but its damage output in comparison to some of these other decks is a lot lower. I feel like I can kind of just get overpowered by anything that isn't able to properly disrupt.
yeah. I think one of the big cards for the deck at the moment is that Fright Night Evil Toll, a card that I think have seen an increase in play recently. It used to kind of be like a 3 Oblivion Wing, 1 Fright Night. Now it's kind of gone to like the 2 Fright Night. I've seen some decks not even play Oblivion Wing Evil Toll anymore and just like even 3 Fright Night Evil Toll. Just because it's so good against these
Yeah,
meta decks. If they're not able to get a Garbodor or a Hexmaniac down, you can slow them down completely. It's just incredible. Even just like I was a victim of this myself when I was playing Volcanion, only playing Floatstone. I just Lysander Volcanion. It's like, got to attach 3 energies to this thing now. Like, manually attach 3 energies because I got another
yeah,
way of switching. So if your opponent isn't prepared for it and doesn't have another way of switching that's not Floatstone, or if they burn that way of switching, like they only play 1 Escape Rope, Lysander with that Fright Night Evil Toll can buy you like a couple of turns to set up really well.
yeah. I
And
think that Yveltal is a deck that you can kind of if you're ready for it, you can beat it without too much difficulty. But if you're going into a format and you're not expecting a Veltal, it can kind of run over the way that people have built their lists.
yeah, it's a deck that I think has got a lot of good matchups across the board. Um, there's no real strong matchup for Evil Toll at the moment. Like, there's nothing that it just like kind of auto wins against that I can think of at the top of my head. I just think it's got a lot of close matchups, and
Yeah,
it can pretty much go either way depending on what list they're playing. Like as you said, some of the crucial cards like Enhanced Hammers and Parallel Cities can come into play a lot. Like Parallel City against Mega Ray is incredible. If you're playing that Mew against Mega Mewtwo is very good. So I think it
yeah,
just comes down to kind of the builds of the decks and the way people choose
yeah.
to
Very
play
much
it.
like Vesper.
Yeah,
You can build it in many different ways.
yeah. Um, I think it's still Evil Toll's been out for like 2 years now, and it's still good. Max Elixir just kind of gives it a bit of a boost as well. Um, I don't know. Max Elixir's an okay card for the deck. I feel like if you're playing a Zoroark line, it's probably not as good, from what I've tested anyway.
Yeah.
Because when you're playing a Zoroark line, you're now having to find like 6 spots for cards because you need the 2/2 Zoroark and 2 Floatstone and possibly even a break. So you take up a lot of space with that, and you might have to cut your energies back a bit. And Max Elixir becomes a little less better than what it is with like Evil Toll Mew, because you can Max Elixir to a Mew obviously, which is very good.
Yeah.
So I think it really just comes down to the build of not only the Evil Toll deck, but the opposing deck as well, and how prepared the player is for the matchup. I think an Evil Toll game could go either way in this format anyway.
There's not too many lightning type attackers in the format as well, which is another good console. In previous formats, lightning was one of the biggest types, but right now there really isn't a lot.
Yeah. The only problem I see with Evil Toll in the future is if Mega Rayquaza becomes really, really good, then people are going to start to play things like these Zeb Strikers and the Raichu, which in turn is just going to hurt Evil Toll. Next up,
Zeb Strikers already starting to see play.
Yeah, Zeb Strikers, like, it does see a decent amount of play, especially in like decks like Vespiquen. Like, they can just play it and beat and like Mega Ray and Evil Toll.
Yeah.
But yeah, if any lightning decks really start to pick up any steam, then Evil Toll just kind of suffers from that, obviously. And there's no real good non-lightning weak dark Pokemon. Like, Darkrai's okay, but I think when you're playing Evil Toll, you're also playing the DCE, so it's like you play like maybe like 8 or 9 dark energy. So if lightning Pokemon do see more in play in the standard format, I think Evil Toll will probably go down a bit.
Definitely.
Next up, we got Mega Gardevoir. Kind of a roguish / surprise deck, I would say. However, this deck does actually have a lot of good matchups, and relatively consistent, I would say, as well. It can play all sorts of different things with this deck as well. So I know you've kind of played against this deck, haven't you, Mega Gardevoir?
I've played against this deck a lot.
Yeah. So you might know a bit more about this than I would. I have played it against it a little bit, but you can kind of talk more about this than I would.
Sure thing. So I think there's kind of 2 different main builds of Gardevoir. You can kind of go with the Steam, like the dual type Gardevoir, and you can focus on that and play like heaps of different Hoopers and Shamans and a bunch of different basic Pokemon. Just aim to like use Skyfield, discard all the Pokemon you don't need every turn, do heaps of damage, and that variant's really strong, especially against the Mewtwo decks, because being a Psychic type, Gardevoir 1 hits Mewtwo and only needs 2 energy, unlike the other Gardevoir, which needs 3, so it makes it harder for Mewtwo to get the knockout. And the other one is really like the non-dual type Gardevoir, the Primal Flash. Yeah, Brilliant Arrow. That one is just a really strong attack. Like with Geomancy Xerneas, you can get that going with Mega Turbos, Max Elixirs. That can hit really strong early, which surprises a lot of people, actually.
Yeah.
I think it has a few really good matchups. As I said, it's got the Mewtwo matchup, it's got the Yveltal matchup pretty much down. Unless they can kind of trap you with Fright Knight, Yveltal really doesn't have much of a chance at beating this.
Yeah. Going back to the Steam Siege, then
its biggest weakness would definitely
be Sizzle. Did you say?
Yeah, Sizzle is.
Yeah,
Sizzle is the one thing this deck can't deal.
So going back to that Steam Siege Mega Gardevoir, I think now with Karen in the format as well, it does get a little bit better, because you can play these Hoopers, get the Shamans, get this full bench, and just discard whatever you need, and then Karen get it all back and do it all over again. I think a nice like 2/2 line is probably the way to build this deck. Just kind of gives
I agree with that.
Yeah, like you have pretty much anything for any given matchup. You'd be
also the Xerneas Break is a really strong non-EX attacker for this deck, which allows it to trade well.
Because the aim of this Mega Gardevoir deck is to get like as many Fairy energies down as well. Xerneas Break does benefit from that as well. As you said, with cards like Max Elixir and Mega Turbo in the format, it's very easy to get a lot of damage out with this Mega Gardevoir, the the Primal Clash one. But the Steam Siege one's also very strong, especially against that Mewtwo deck. It just kind of wins against Mewtwo. And it does
Yeah,
have a
it's
lot
also
of...
a very strong attacker against the lower HP Pokemon, such as the Rainbow Road Xerneas.
Yeah,
You can just use the Steam Siege to discard a Shaman or a Hooper every turn and do 120 damage for just 2 energy. And it makes it hard for Rainbow Road to just get those cheap Lysander kills on your
yeah.
weaky Expo.
Or even like getting rid of something that's got a lot of damage on it that can be potentially knocked out through something like a Galvantula or a Fright Knight attack. You
Yeah.
can get rid of that off the bench and save yourself like losing a potential 1 or 2 prizes. So that's kind of like where Mega Gardevoir does have some strong points to it. I just think there's probably going to be a lot of Mega Sizzle early on as well, just trying to counter like this Mega Mewtwo and Mega Rayquaza decks. And Mega Guardy just doesn't have a good matchup against Mega Sizzle at all.
It also folds hard to Mega Rayquaza if that ever picks up in play once Jet Evolution comes.
Yeah, that's fair. Next up, we got Garchomp. Probably the biggest surprise on the entire tier list is this Garchomp deck. So, I've talked about Garchomp on the channel before. It's a deck I actually really enjoy, especially with this Talonflame and Bursting Bloom. So you can talk about this one to start off with. So what are your thoughts on this Garchomp deck, and why did it rank so high with these other decks that we've put into this 1.2 tier?
Well, looking at the format, it's very EX based in comparison to the last 1 or 2 formats where there was a deck like Night March which was running around just everywhere.
Yeah.
So like Garchomp probably deals with EXs more than better than any other deck, being able to do like double damage for just 2 energy. And with that Bursting Balloon, it can really deal with Megas efficiently as well. And thanks to the Bursting Balloon, it actually doesn't have a terrible price trade with non-EXs either like it used to. You can at least go like 1-for-1 with most stuff like a Xerneas with Rainbow Road. You can hit it for 60 or 80,
Yeah.
and then they attack you, they take 60 and knock themselves out.
The strong energy
So
also helps that
it's
as well.
probably... Yeah, exactly. It's still got some that crucial fighting support, even though it did lose Karina.
Karina's
And the Talonflame really helps you set up.
Yeah, I think...
It is. But Talonflame... So it's not too bad for setup if you open Talonflame, and even if you don't, I mean, Gibble does have that never enough attack to help you set up if you need to.
It's a deck I actually like in this format. I think it does have a lot of good matchups. I guess pretty much the bad matchups are any deck that can kind of outspeed it, because we are playing a stage 2 Pokemon, which everyone knows is quite hard to get out. But I think when you look at some of the other decks in the format, a lot of them are Mega type decks, which also have to wait that 1 turn before they can Mega Evolve. So if you're able to set up your Garchomp before your opponent sets up anything, then it can really just be insanely good. And Talonflame does help the setup a lot as well. Not only does it deal out 40 damage, which I actually think is really good, because like between that 40 damage onto like something like a Mewtwo, then a Mega Evolves, then you can go up into this Garchomp with like a strong energy or something. You can knock out a Mewtwo, if I've done my maths right. It does 160, doesn't it? Yeah. With strong energy, you'll be hitting for the 180 plus the 40 is 220, and you can knock out that Mega Mewtwo. So I think the 40 damage from the Talonflame also does come into play a little bit, with helping to get these.
As well as in conjunction with the Bursting Balloon damage, it can really stack up pretty quick.
Yeah, very good as well. So that is the tier.
I was going to say, I think this deck's biggest weakness is, as you said, the fact that it's a bit slower, and it really doesn't have anything to deal with those non-EX focused decks like Vespiquen and maybe the Rainbow Road Xerneas deck.
Yeah, Vespiquen would kind of... It's got a weakness to Vespiquen as well.
That's correct.
Which doesn't help at all. But anything, I think, it should be okay against like other non-EX decks. Like, it should be decent enough against Volcanion, I think. Volcanion is probably not the worst matchup for it, but Vespiquen is definitely a deck that's quicker.
Any fast non-EX deck this should struggle with.
Fast non-EX deck. Rainbow Road is kind of the same as Vespiquen, where it can be really fast. Of course, there are circumstances with Rainbow Road where you just kind of don't get everything going as fast as you'd like. Like sometimes it can take like 1 or 2 turns before you've got a Xerneas set up, and then you can, in between that, you can get a Garchomp set up, and just kind of start to attack these Xerneas. Although Xerneas does also usually play that EXP share, and then they're just gonna you just kind of get into this trading prizes, and I think later in the game it's going to be harder for you to keep up with that, just because we are trying to play like you're playing a stage 2 line, whereas they're only playing basics. They can easily get those back, like where it's harder for a Garchomp player to recover late game.
That's for sure.
So we're going to move on to tier 1. So we're going to just name the deck, and then we'll break down some of the matches and go more in depth with these decks. So we'll start with Mega Scizor. Kind of the anti-meta, I would say, for a lot of it. Probably the best disruption deck easily in the format. So why don't you get us started on this Mega Scizor deck, and we'll talk about some of the bad matchups it does have. There's the obvious one. There's some of the good matchups that it has.
So as you said, Mega Scizor, as opposed to most of the other tier 1 decks, doesn't focus on its pure damage, but more on the disruption side of it. It has, I think that it's a deck that no one ever really looked at until this post rotation, and now it just happens to have some good stats against some of the other decks. Like it's the resistance, and there's a lot of other cards going for it, like the shield energy you can play and Parallel City to reduce deck's damage. So you can kind of take a lot of hits, especially against Mewtwo with resistance. You can use it to like ditch the Skyfield from decks like Rayquaza or Rainbow Road, and there really isn't that many decks which don't rely on either Special Energy or Stadium cards right now, and Sizzle really takes advantage of that.
Yeah, I can't think of really any deck that doesn't play one or the other at the moment.
Yeah.
And even if they are playing, if they're not playing as Special Energies or Stadium cards, or if they're just not playing Special Energies, you usually see those Crushing Hammers and the Team Flagrant in this deck as well. So there is that level of other disruption that the deck does bring to it, which is very good.
The deck also is probably the most common deck for playing Garbodor, and that partners really well with this deck, because even those decks which don't really rely on Special Energy usually rely on abilities quite well, such as Greninja.
Yeah. Greninja's... Now I think it plays like 2 Splash Energies, but they are going to bring that back to their hand anyway, so... Oh no, they're not with Splash Energies. They usually keep the Splash Energy there.
Oh, they can.
But you can discard it anyway.
Against a Sizzle, they probably won't. And the other good thing Sizzle has going for it is it's probably the best energy efficient attack. Like two energy for 120, very cheap, and it can kind of just 2-shot anything in the format and can't be 1-shot by much. So at the very least, even if your opponent is able to get through that disruption, you are still 2-shotting each other in the end anyway.
Yeah. As you said, the Garbodor as well. There's a lot of decks. A lot of the Mega decks. I think pretty much every Mega deck now plays that Hooper EX, the Shaman EXs, things like Mega Rayquaza, and as we said, a possible like Mega Gardevoir with the Steam Siege build. Mega Gardevoir is going to rely heavily on those Hoopers and Shamans even after their first turn. Like if you get a Parallel City down against the Mega Rayquaza and have that Garbodor set up, that just kind of wins you the game, because they can't get that Hooper down to get 3 more EXs. So it's very good in that sense as well.
Especially with the engines mile.
Yeah. It also does have
the engines mile makes it hard.
It also does have a non-EX attacker that can be paired with the deck, and that's Cobalion, which is sometimes seen, sometimes not seen. It can be very good late game, and also just like any EX heavy deck that can afford to play a non-EX Pokemon in it's very good, because then you're essentially making your opponent play that 7 prize game, which is always strong. And it's also not a bad starter if you're going second, because you can kind of stall a turn as well with it. So that's
the quick guard attack is...
Yeah. So we'll talk about some of the matchups with this deck. We'll start with the good matchups. This is probably the 2 better matchups. There is obviously going to be more matchups than this. There's Rainbow Road and Mega Rayquaza, which we think this deck does have a lot of... will usually beat Rainbow Road and Mega Rayquaza. I would also put Mega Gardevoir on this list as well, which is a deck we kind of overlooked when we originally talked about this. So why don't we talk about some of those matchups now, the Rainbow Road matchup and the Mega Ray and the Mega Gardevoir matchup.
Yeah. So starting with like the Mega Ray, and I think the Mega Ray and Rainbow Road matchup are very similar.
Yeah.
Because they're the decks which not rely on both special energy and stadiums, whereas most decks only rely on one or the other. So being able to disrupt both the stadium and the special energy at times, and especially considering Sizzle often plays Garbodor and Parallel, can really shut these decks down completely. And I mean, I guess Rainbow Road does have a slightly better matchup if it gets going, considering it's a non-EX price trade. But it's also a lot harder for Rainbow Road to deal with those crushing hammers than Mega Rayquaza, because it's a lot easier to get a Mega Turbo than an Elixir.
Yeah, that's probably one of the best things going for it is the energy denial against Rainbow Road. Rainbow Road, plays like what, 7 or 8 basic energies as well. So if you're able to like put yourself in a position where you can Crushing Hammer or Team Flare Grunt away from a Xerneas that you're about to knock out, and then your opponent doesn't get the EXP share, whilst also discarding their Skyfield, is very strong.
Yeah.
Because then, especially if your opponent's only got this one Xerneas down, they don't have another one with any energies on it, then they're kind of relying on hitting this Elixir as well, which is kind of scary for any Rainbow Road player to be relying off an Elixir to be able to fight back against the Mega Sizzle. So I think that's...
I also think it's worth noting that with just one shield energy, Sizzle makes Rainbow Road require an additional basic Pokemon, like a different type on the bench, to be able to knock it out in one hit, which can be pretty big when you compare it with like the Stadium Denial.
Yeah, especially like with that Parallel City. It is easier for Rainbow Road to recover from a Parallel City than it is for Mega Ray, but as you said, with that shield energy, it just becomes a little bit harder for Rainbow Road to do that.
Yeah.
So I suppose Mega Ray is kind of the same matchup. It's a little different. I don't think many Rainbow Road decks tend to play Special Charge. They might, whereas Mega Ray Quasar does play the Special Charge usually, so it does kind of help them a bit. But when you've got that Garbodor, Parallel City, Stadium Denial, and even when you are discarding so many energies as well, I think it's very hard for Mega Rayquaza to keep up. And Mega Gardevoir just has the obvious weakness. Anything can beat anything, and then it's got the weakness advantage. Just one-shotting these Mega Gardevoirs. I don't really think there's anything a Gardevoir player could do to stop a Mega Sizzle from winning.
I mean, I guess it does have that. I think it's called Shining Wind or something, which removes Gardevoir's weakness, but it does only do 100 damage.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the regular Gardevoir EX's second attack, costs 3 energy.
So even then, it's like
I've played against Gardevoir a lot. Yeah, and I mean, Sizzle also has the energy denial aspect against Gardevoir, which can reduce its damage output.
Yeah.
I mean, Sizzle's downside is supposed to be that it doesn't do as much damage, but when you give it the damage output of a Rayquaza plus the energy denial side of it, there's really not much Gardevoir can do against it.
Yeah. One other deck that we did have written down here was Mewtwo as well, which I think is just kind of a pretty easy deck to guess as well. Just being able to discard DCEs off of Mewtwo, even getting rid of things like Shrine of Memories as well, can be very good. Can stop your opponent from being able to damage change that 120 onto a Shaman.
Yeah, and of course the resistance combined with the shield energy can really make it hard for Mewtwo to hit those big numbers. Especially considering
2 energies for 220 HP. That's like Mewtwo needs like
makes it really hard for Mewtwo.
Mewtwo needs like 6 energies on it. Seven with the resistance.
6, something like that.
Yeah. Oh no, it would be 6 energies, which is just crazy to think about. Especially when you're playing that energy denial, you can Crushing Hammer Team Grunt, get rid of it, and they will never be able to like one-shot you. And also just being able to get rid of that Shrine of Memories, I think, is also a crucial card to get rid of as well, because we are hitting for 120, which is enough for a Mewtwo to damage change onto a Shaman. So you want to kind of make sure there's never a Shrine of Memories down as well.
Yeah.
Some of the bad matchups Sizzle has is the obvious one is Volcanion, just with that weakness. It's kind of the same way how Mega Sizzle's got a good matchup against Mega Guardi. It's got a bad matchup against Volcanion, just because Volcanion in the first turn can just like steam up twice, and a Fury Bolt knocks out a basic Sizzle. Then later in the game, you got like 4 Volcanions down. You know, just steam up a bunch, and even like the non-EX can just power heater for enough damage to knock out this Scizor EX. So there's not much to talk about there. Just having the
Yeah.
weakness with the steam up ability as well is just crazy.
Even with Garbodor, there isn't really much Sizzle can do to
Oh
beat
yeah,
it.
yeah, Garbodor. Like even if they do get up, you can just power heater and get so many Pokemon built up that can just hit like. Um, if you've got a Fury Belt onto a basic Volcanion, they can use what's the second attack called?
Steam Artillery.
Steam Artillery for 110 times 2 is 220, which can knock it out. And Volcanion X hits 130, so 260
Yeah.
with the weakness. And then the other bad matchup that we have put down here is Evil Toll. Now, do you want to kind of explain this as well?
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, I think Scizor, more so than most of the other Mega decks, gets hit hard by this Fright Night of Elton. I mean, Mega Rayquaza can kind of just evolve on the first turn, so it doesn't really matter if it loses those Spirit Links. And Mewtwo can kind of just evolve and then one hit the Fright Night on the next turn anyway, so it might only get attacked once or twice. But
Yeah.
this Sizzle deck, ideally, like, if it has to waste a turn to Mega Evolve and then it has to two-shot the Fright Night Evolve while it's taking 60 damage on the active and 60 on the bench, is really hard to deal with unless you can get rid of those energy. And the other problem with this matchup is that this is a deck that, even though it does play special energy, it can easily get away with just using those basic energies for the Evil Ball attack, and when it uses the Y Cyclone attack, can move the DCE to the bench so that it can't be knocked off by Sizzle. So it really just does a lot of damage for cheap, but very much like Sizzle, but needs less setup and can disrupt Sizzle pretty well. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't say this is a super bad matchup, but I certainly wouldn't want to see it if I was playing
Yeah, I
Sizzle,
think it's more favorable for Evil Toll than it is for Sizzle.
especially if those max elixirs to set up.
Yeah. And we'll move on now. Volcanion is another tier 1 deck that we've got.
Mhm.
Just so fast. It has potential to just do so much damage in the first turn and then accelerate energy quickly. So do you want to talk about this Volcanion deck?
Yeah, no problem. So I mean, as you said, it's very fast. The power heater, if you do manage to get enough Volcanion EXs in play, you can do up to 150 damage on the first turn for the one energy while you're accelerating. I mean, this deck often plays Max Elixir, and I think the combination of Max Elixir and Power Heater gives this deck the best acceleration in the game compared to all the other decks, even Mega Mewtwo, which has those double colors and the Mega Turbo. I think Volcanion's even more efficient than that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other good thing about this deck is that it can kind of use the non-EX trade against the next power heater, or it can go for that EX trade using the volcanic heat and can kind of go for either of those directions to cover a lot of different matchups, which makes it a very solid deck overall.
So some of the good matchups for this deck, the Sizzle matchup, which we already talked about. Um, it just, the weakness just kind of doesn't really help Sizzle at all. And then we've also got the mirror matchup for this deck, which is also a good and a bad matchup for this deck, I would say. It just kind of depends on the build and depends who gets set up quickly. Of course, Volcanion EX is a dual type, fire water type, so you do just kind of
Self-weak.
Yeah, self-weak. So it just comes into a war of who can get their Volcanion EX set up first and hit for that crucial knockout, and who can consistently do that as well, because there is, of course, you're going to need like Pokemon Ranger to be able to do it enough. So it's kind of a matchup of who can get set up fast and who can stay set up as well. So that is.
I think Volcanion is a deck that has a lot of. Oh, sorry, go for it.
No, you can go for it.
Oh, sorry. All right. I think Volcanion is a deck that has a lot of even or 50-50 matchups overall.
Yeah.
But the biggest problem with this deck, similar to Greninja, is I think the fact that there's Garbodor and no way to remove tools.
Yeah. So some of the bad matchup for this deck, as you said, is that Garbodor. So Mewtwo Garbodor, you just can't really beat Garbodor at the moment. You need to Lysander, Trubbish early, knock it out. It's a lot easier to do it with this deck than it is to do with like Greninja, just because it's a Lysander,
True.
2 Steam Ups, and Power Heater. But if they're playing like a 2-2 liner, they get 2 Trubbish down first turn. Then you're in a bit of trouble. Even if you're able to knock out one Garbodor, they still might be able to get another setup. Some Mewtwo decks even play like a Hex Maniac, so they could Hex on their first turn to prevent that from happening as well. So it's just kind of a bad matchup, and Mewtwo will eventually just get enough energies where it can just one-shot everything, and you won't be able to respond because of that Garbodor. And then we've also got Mega Rayquaza. Now, you kind of had a good reason for this Mega Rayquaza matchup. Do you want to explain why this Mega Ray is a bad matchup?
So yeah, Volcanion is. I mean, there's a few different ways to build Volcanion, but a common one is using Hooper and Skyfield to set up heaps of the Volcanion EX early. And I think that any deck which is playing Skyfield and doesn't focus on using non-EXs just loses to Rayquaza. I mean, with no counter stadium, you're really not shutting Rayquaza off in any way, and it's probably just going to do 240 damage every turn of the game. There's not really any way to knock out a Rayquaza early or even in the middle of the game. You really only way is to use a Volcanic Heat with 3 Steam Ups at least to knock it out.
Yeah.
So it makes it really hard for this to trade with Rayquaza.
Yeah, really hard. Even
especially considering Rayquaza plays 2 Hex often.
Yeah, the Hex Maniac's another big card that comes into it. I still would say that this deck is tier 1 though, because it does get slowed down by Hex Maniac and everything, but it's still across the board got relatively good matchups. One matchup that you could say is kind of bad would be Vileplume Box, which we did talk about, but Volcanion does tend to play that Ranger, and Regice doesn't hit for enough to knock us out, neither does Glaceon to knock out the EX. So even if Jolteon does come up, if you can get the Clutch Ranger, Jolteon's got Jolteon's only
160,
160, so it's like 1 Steam Up and you're good to go and you knock it out. So I don't think Vileplume Box is a bad matchup. I would say it just kind of really depends on what you draw into. You can also easily knock out a Vileplume, so there's that as well.
True.
And then finally, the last deck that we've got here, and I've called this deck the best deck in format, and that's Rainbow Road. So I know you've tested Rainbow Road as well. So let's talk about this deck, because I think across the board, this deck doesn't really have a horrible matchup. It's definitely got some unfavorable matchups, but you can still win in those matchups as well. So why don't you can get started on this Rainbow Road deck.
I think Rainbow Road is the closest thing to the Night March of this format. I mean, it's a non-EX based deck. It can, not as easily, but it can start hitting for those really big numbers on the first turn. And unlike Night March, it actually has a decent amount of HP. Yeah. So not anything can just knock it out in one hit. I mean, as you said, it does have a few even matchups or unfavorable matchups. But those are matchups that you can kind of just beat if you get a good hand. It can just do 220 damage or 250 damage, whatever it is, every turn.
Yeah. One of the things that this deck does have going for it is the dual-type Pokemon that we got in Steam Siege, which just kind of helps the deck so much. Even losing a Skyfield isn't as bad if you've got a Volcanion and Galvantula down. That's 2 Pokemon sitting on your bench that essentially act as 4, which is very good. And that Galvantula is also a very, very strong card as well. It does come up quite a lot. Being able to 2-shot multiple Shaymins is incredibly strong. And even if your opponent decides, they've got the option to knock out that Galvantula, but then they've still got 2 Shaymins sitting there with 60 damage on them each, you can easily set up another Galvantula and 1 energy and knock him out. They could also just retreat and Sky Return to save one of their Shaymins. Then if they're doing that, they're not knocking out the Galvantula, and they're also just kind of wasted a turn to save 2 prizes. So it's a tough spot for them to be in.
Galvantula is even better now because there's no easy in the format, so realistically the only way, besides Sky Returning, to clear your bench is just to use Parallel City. And if they Parallel City themselves, then they're not Parallel Citying you.
Yeah.
Well, Parallel Citying you, which makes
kind of what you want to do against Rainbow Road.
Exactly. And also, it is worth noting that Galvantula is also a grass type, which actually comes up quite big against some of those other decks like Greninja, Archomp, which only have 60 HP grass type Pokemon. Or even that Manaphy EX, which is seeing a little bit.
There are a lot of 60 HP basics that evolve into things which are weak to grass, which can become really big. Just taking if your opponent is playing that Greninja deck, they get the Talonflame, they get two Froakies on the bench, it goes into your turn, you get the Galvantula, and you knock out the two Froakies that they just put down, and then
Yeah.
they've got to put down another Froakie, and then Talonflame only hits you for 40, and you're just going to knock out that last Froakie. So it's a very favourable matchup with that Galvantula. It does come up quite a bit as well. And going back to being able to remove Pokemon off the bench, they could also Ninja Boy, but then even if they do that, they've got like another Pokemon with still 60 HP sitting on it, which can come up later in the game to just get an easy knockout if they like try and Parallel City. There's still that 60 damage there, so you might still be able to pick a knockout off that.
Yeah, definitely.
Or also if they retreat and then Olympia to heal 30 from the Shaman. Um,
There are options, of course. I think
yeah,
one of my
max
favorite
potion.
things. Yeah, true.
There are
One of my
options, but
favorite
it's
things
unlikely.
one of my favorite things about this deck is just how many diverse ways there are to build it as well. I mean, unlike Night March, where you could put maybe tech in like a Milotic line or something, but
Yeah.
realistically, there wasn't too many ways to build Night March. But you can build this with like a stage one focus where you build that Bisharp and the Galvantula, and you just have a lot of the evolution lines, or you can go for that Hooper based list with bunch of different basic type Pokemon, and just the fact that there's a lot of different ways to build this deck, and there isn't really a wrong or right answer, really allows a player to prove like how their deck building of the deck might differ to other people and might be the difference between winning and losing some matchups.
Yeah, that's the thing. Xerneas can just benefit off of any different type. So there's so many different Pokemon you could play literally anything in this deck. There are probably
Yeah.
obviously better options to play the deck. There's also things like the Mew, Psychic Pokemon, and kind of acts as another Xerneas in a way. Essentially gives you like
Yeah.
a fifth Xerneas, and like not that it's really needed, but it can help in that Mewtwo matchup. Just like hits for insane numbers against Mewtwo. But there's so many different ways of building this deck, which is really why I enjoy it so much. Just because there's so many different cards and surprises you can play with this. One of the ones that I personally like is Flygon EX. Because no one really knows what Flygon EX does, because it's a promo that you buy in a box and it's like worth $2 or something. It's not a very common card that you see, and it's actually very, very strong. I actually use it so much now that I've been testing the deck. I use it more and more. Just putting a Floatstone onto it, going up into it when a Xerneas gets knocked out, really good. Because if your opponent's got something, like it came up once where I've got this Pokemon sitting there with 30 HP remaining, I can Voice of the Sands, bring something else up, and then Galvantula to knock it out, and also put like 60 into a Shaman. Potentially, if that Shaman's already been hit with a Galvantula, then taking like multiple prizes through that. Just also, your opponent might have a bench where there's nothing they want going into the active spot that isn't their active Pokemon. Like they might only have one Shaman on the bench,
Yeah.
or like if they've got like a
Just
Hooper
all the
there,
X's.
or yeah, there's just something they don't want being in the active spot. Um, Jolteon EX, for example, if they use that Jolteon EX to kind of stop you from being able to attack it, you could Voice of the Sands to put it onto the bench and then Lysander it up and knock it out with Xerneas. So that's also very good. So we'll talk about some of the bad matchups for this deck. We said Mega Sizzle is probably one of the worst matchups, but I don't actually think it's too bad. I think you can still beat Mega Sizzle. It just does require a bit of luck, and and kind of a bit of bad luck on the Sizzle player. If they draw really good and they hit all the Crushing Hammers, then you're not going to win then. But if they miss like a couple of Crushing Hammers, and you're able to survive a couple of turns before they can really start to apply a lot of pressure, you can set up a couple of Xerneas, you can hit the max elixirs, and everything goes well for you. I don't think it's the worst matchup, but it's probably really the only bad matchup for this. We do have one other deck written down here, which again isn't the worst matchup. We'll just quickly talk about this Mega Sizzle matchup. We already did talk about the Mega Sizzle matchup before, so I'll briefly talk about it now. Do you want to say anything else about the Mega Sizzle matchup with this Rainbow Road deck?
So yeah, as we said before, it really does suck for Rainbow Road that it relies so heavily on both the special energy and the stadium, although the Sky and special energy doesn't really matter if you're going to knock them out anyway. So I guess if you can just charge up Xerneas on the bench consistently, you can still be able to one-hit that Mega Sizzle every turn or every few turns. The biggest problem is Crushing Hammers hitting onto the bench. It means you have to get luckier with max elixirs and be having to set up so many Pokemon on the bench with Parallel City down and with the shield energies to bring Scissor up to 230, 240 HP. Makes it really hard for Rainbow Road to recover from being Parallel City'd every turn, or losing the Skyfield at the very least.
It's still not, I don't think, horrible, but it's still a bad matchup, I would say. The other deck
I
that we
mean,
have,
so I was just going to say, one thing that you can add to the deck to kind of counter the Sizzle deck is, I guess, the Carbink with, I think it's called Energy Keeper, which prevents the basic energy attached to your
yeah,
basic Pokemon from being discarded.
yeah. Um,
So, I mean, that stops Crushing Hammer, but it's
there is also the
still,
Regirock promo, which I played.
yes,
Um,
right.
so you can put energies onto that. Of course they can. They can't. They can't actually Lysander. I was gonna say they can Lysander, but you can kind of have this thing set up on the bench, and then
And
just kind
Ninja
of
Boy.
yeah, Ninja Boy into that, into the Xerneas as well. So that's a potential play you can make
That's,
against the deck as well. Next, we've also got written down Vile Plume Box, which again, I think if they're able to set up that item lock, this is what we talked about. If they're able to set up the item lock before, like if they get it first turn, it's really, really tough because you need so
yeah,
much. And then when they've got that item lock and then they get the attack lock as well, it's just really difficult. If they miss that in the first couple of turns and they allow you to kind of build up slightly, then I think it's more favorable. So again, I think it's just a matchup, which is just kind of dependent on each player's draws and kind of who goes first as well. So do you want
yeah.
to talk about that matchup as well?
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, I think one of the big play Pokemon in that matchup as well is that Flagon. As you said, you can use the Flagon to switch something like a Jolteon out of the active and then bring it up. I mean, this is harder to do if your opponent has Vileplume in play because you have to actually have the Lysander in your hand, and you also have to make sure you get that Floatstone onto the
Yeah,
Flagon, otherwise you won't be able to use that play. But if you can, set up, say, a few Xerneases on the bench and get a Flagon with a Floatstone so you can remove that to play Ranger, and that would work as well. But it really is hard to do any of this under item lock, especially when your opponent is two-shotting your main attacker.
yeah. If that item lock wasn't there, these decks usually play like two Jolteon EX, I'd say. That's kind of standard. Um, so if you're able to knock out these two Jolteon EXs, I think from there you should win, regardless, because they just uh, Glaceon doesn't really do anything against you. Regice doesn't do anything. Regice
Yeah,
can potentially paralyze you, which could get frustrating, but that's about it. Like, if you're able to get rid of those Jolteons, if they go first, they miss the item lock, and then leave a Jolteon active, you could just kind of have an explosive turn, knock out one Jolteon, set yourself up where if that second one does come up, you could Voice of the Sands, Lysander plays, and knock out that second one, and I think from there, you're in a favorable position. But again, I think
yeah,
it's just a deck that comes down to what you can draw into, and it is kind of a luck-based game with this matchup here.
100%.
Now, some of the good matches, and we say some of the good matches because it does have a lot of good matchups. So we got Mega Rayquaza. It's just kind of, I compare Xerneas to Mega Rayquaza a lot. They're very similar, but Xerneas is a non-EX attacker. Can play a lot more variety with it as well. So
Yeah,
things like even the Galvantula is decent enough in this deck because you are hitting two. Like if you're able to, if you're not hitting for a knockout with this Rainbow Road and they retreat, then you can bring up the Galvantula. You're still hitting 60 to those. Um, you could just try heavily going for this Galvantula and just knock out like four Shamans if they play them down. You
yeah,
can just
true.
focus on that. But I think even without that, Xerneas just hits so much damage, especially when you're both playing Skyfield. You don't have to worry about your Skyfield being dropped. So is there anything you want to add to that one?
I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, as you said, the Golbantula can you can really just steal the Rayquaza game even without the favorable price trade. I think the main thing Rayquaza has over the Xerneas deck is the fact that it can probably set up Rayquazas a little bit easier thanks to Mega Turbo instead of Max Elixir. But even if your opponent does set up like an extra attack or two, they're still going to lose in the long run if you're able to just knock out three Rayquazas back to back.
Yeah. So we've also got Giratina. Pretty self-explanatory there, just the weakness. And when we say Giratina, we mean any Giratina build. So like Dark Tina, Xerneas Tina, Straight Tina, whatever it is, we can just, even with that, if they get the lock up quick enough, we just hit for weakness. Even with the parallel city drop,
Yeah,
you only need like the Volcanion. You only actually need the three Pokemon. It doesn't even need to be a Volcanion or anything, because we are hitting for,
yeah,
unless they've got like, a Fury Belt. Um, but yeah,
true.
it's just like so easy to get the knockout on Giratinas. I don't think there's really anything else we really need to add to that. The lock
No.
can be annoying, um, but it's not the end of the world, especially if you do have a decent start. If you like hit the Max Elixir's first turn and you get a Xerneas set up before they get the lock, then it's okay.
Yeah,
Even if they get the lock, you can just kind of slowly attach. Like Giratina also is two-shotting you, so
yeah. Even
you
with Fury Belt.
yeah, even with Fury Belt, unless they like Giovanni scheme, they're two-shotting you, so you should be safe for a couple of turns to slowly power up Xerneas if you have to, and even if they do attack you once, you're just gonna come back and one-shot them anyway. And then finally, we've
Yeah.
got Evil Toll. Now, do you want to explain this one? It's kind of, again, one of those self-explanatory. I think this is probably, of the two other ones, it's still a good matchup, but it can still sway in Evil Toll's favor as well.
Yeah. As we were saying with it, Evil Tool before, I think it comes down to not only the Rainbow Road list, but the Evolta list as well. I think if Evolta chooses to play a few hammers, either enhanced or crushing, as well as a few parallel city, and have that Fury belted Evolta X, it can kind of be hard for a Xerneas to knock out the Evolta X. But on the other hand, if the Xerneas player were to play a Fury Belt on their Xerneas, it would make it very hard for the Evolta player to knock it
Yeah.
out. And the price trade does just work out very well for Xerneas here. Another play that the Evolta player can make is using the Fright Knight to Lysander up something like a Volcanion or a Hooper or a Flygon, and locking it active with thanks to Floatstone can kind of give them an out to catching up. But problem with that is you can't really use Fright Knight to spear the Xerneases because they're non-EX. I mean, you can use it to take prizes, but if
Yeah.
you're trying to disrupt your opponent, you can't really use it to stop their strategy and just to stall.
Yeah. Um, just the resistance is just incredible in this matchup as well.
Yeah,
Like that Fright Night Evil Toll goes from two-shotting Azonius to three-shotting Azonius, which, if they three-shot Azonius, it'd be insane that Azonius wasn't set up by then. Um, but I
yeah,
think this matchup is just so favorable, just to so many circumstances. Of course, like there are probably games where the Evil Toll player could win this. Just kind of depends on some of the cards they play as well. I think Mew is kind of a big one, because it does get rid of that resistance. Um,
yeah.
Things like Zoroark as well. The Rainbow Road player
Yes,
might bench too much, and then like if they play multiple Zoroarks, they can come up and hit you for a lot. Um, Even being able to Lysander some of your EXs and take two prizes and just kind of play it like that, if they just try and like they get into the mindset of, I'm not attacking a Xerneas, I'm just going to target your EX Pokemon, then it kind
yeah,
of can be a little tough. But if you realize that's what your opponent's doing game one, then game two you should play a bit smarter and not bench as much, if you're going against Zoroark. So it does come down to kind of the Evil Toll build as well, in this matchup. I think
yeah.
it's still pretty favourable, regardless. Um, is there anything else you'd like to add to that one?
I did actually forget about the Zoroark, and Zoroark can be a big factor in this matchup
Yeah.
because it pretty much is the same as a Xerneas, but cheaper. I mean, it is a stage one, but it only costs the DC as opposed to three energy. So if your opponent is playing more of like a quad Zoroark build, it might be difficult because they're able to just knock you out every turn.
Yeah, I think if they're
But
playing like four
as you
Zoroarks,
said, you
it
can
does get
just
tough.
yeah, definitely. But you can be smart with your bench to make sure they can't knock you out. I mean, you can knock out a Zoroark with only three types on the bench, but Zoroark can't knock you out with three on the
Yeah,
bench.
and
So
especially with having that
play
Volcanion in the deck as well,
exactly. That
it's like
means
two
you
Pokemon on
potentially
the
only need
bench,
two. Yeah.
and then
So like
they aren't even two-shotting you because they'd be hitting 70 because you've got two minus the 20, so they'd be hitting you for 50. So
yeah. So
it's
like I
yeah,
think you can get around Zoroark if you play smart, but it is probably one of the harder parts of that about that matchup, especially if they do target down those EX Pokemon.
yeah. But again, just depending on the build, if they don't play the Zoroark, it's definitely a lot more favorable. If they are playing the Zoroark, I just kind of guess it comes down to whoever's smarter with it. Like if the Rainbow Road player is smart enough to see what's going on, then they should be able to put themselves in a position. Like if they've just got
Yeah.
one Zonix on the bench, one in the active, and a Volcanion on the bench, they should be right from there. Like they can even put like a couple more down because how much does a Zoroark need? Like the Zoroark needs like 4 Pokemon on the bench to knock out his
Yeah.
Xerneas. So you
Actually,
can
4 Pokemon is 130, which with the resistance is actually only 110.
oh there you go. So only 110. So they need 5 Pokemon. So it's still like if you pick up on it early enough, you should be fine. Um,
Yeah.
so that's all the matchups, and that is the tier list completed as well. So now we're just going to briefly talk about evolutions and what changes and any decks added, as well as briefly talk about London as well. So
Yeah.
firstly, evolutions is not the best set to come out in recent times. It's more of a set for collectors, in my opinion, than it is for players. But there are definitely some interesting cards. One of the big players is that Dragonite EX. Do you want to talk about Dragonite EX and what deck gets better with that Dragonite EX?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, the obvious one is the Mega Rayquaza deck. I mean, being able to recover so easily from that Parallel City thanks to Dragonite makes that card really strong. And I can't remember what its attack does exactly, but I do remember
It's
that
like
it actually wasn't
130 and you discard an energy or something, or flip a coin and discard an energy for 4.
something like that. So I mean, it's not even a terrible attacker if you have to go into it with Rayquaza, say versus a Giratina or something like that. Other than that, I don't think Dragonite has too much potential in many other decks. It could be seen in that Rainbow Road deck, but
It's a
I think
colorless
Rainbow Road
Pokemon,
doesn't
so
need
you'll be
it.
playing the Shamans, so
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, you can kind of get away with not needing it thanks to those dual type Pokemon anyway.
Yeah. Like there might be like some decks that could benefit from it eventually, like the Mega Gardevoir deck could definitely.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Um, being able to get back like a Hooper is just incredible. With both Mega Gardevoir and Mega Rayquaza. So I'd say with this Dragonite EX, I would probably put Mega Rayquaza from tier 2 to 1.5.
Yeah,
Um, it also does get Brock Scouts, which is kind of like Karen. Gets back either a combination of 6 Pokemon and energies. So it's like 2 Super Rods in its supporter, which does help the deck as well.
yeah.
And we also think there's probably really only one deck to come from this set, and that's the Beedrill deck. Where do you think this Beedrill deck sits? If you don't know what the Beedrill does, 2 energies and it does 40 for each Beedrill you have in play. With Forest of Giant Plants, it's potential to get like a turn 1 have 4 Beedrill sitting there. Of course, 2 energy makes it awkward.
Yeah.
I think the 2 energy just makes it a little difficult because if you want to play a Max Elixir route, then you have to do that before you evolve, and then it's kind of a bit odd because you want to play enough Max Elixirs that you get them on your first turn before they evolve. But then if you do that, you've then got like 2 or 3 dead Max Elixirs that you just can't play later in the game. So where do you think this Beedrill deck will slide in?
Well, one thing you did forget to mention is that Beedrill's attack actually allows you to hit any Pokemon in play as opposed to just
Any Pokemon
any
player.
active. As for the energy problem, I think that is a big problem for the deck, but you can use those experience shares to kind of make that less of a problem once you're in the mid game. But getting it powered on the first turn really isn't going to be an option, to be honest. Um, it seems pretty strong overall if it can get going. But I think another weakness of this deck is just that prizing pieces is going to be pretty common, being a 4/4 line. And for each piece that you prize, there's one less Beedrill you're going to be able to get into play.
Yeah.
So I think this deck has a lot of weaknesses at the moment, and it's a bit fragile in the way it's going to be built at first. So I wouldn't probably rate it above tier 2.
Yeah, I would say
But
it sits in well in tier 2.
yeah, but I mean, if a good list for it comes out and we find out the proper way to play it, doing 160 damage to any Pokemon played with a non-EX is absurd. Like,
So it's like
that has the potential to be tier 1.
even 120 is enough to knock out Shamans. So even if you don't get the 4 Beedrill turn 1,
Yeah, exactly.
like 120 is still very strong for like a non-EX Pokemon, and that can be powered up so quickly as well. I just think there needs to be a solid way of getting energies down onto this thing. That would help a lot. Yeah, I think you're right with the prizing pieces as well. If you do prize like 1 or 2 Beedrill, then it does get really tough. If you prize like 2 Beedrill, then I think it's pretty much going to be the
Yeah.
game there, because you're only doing 80 damage now. So it does become a bit of a issue with the prize cards. There is like town maps, so you can see where the Beedrill is, but even then it's not the best. And I do think this is one
You
of
do
those.
actually have to take the prizes to be able to get them.
Yeah. I do think this is actually one of those decks that could also benefit from having Karen in the format, because you are going to need to consistently get these Beedrills down. So I don't really know. It's kind of hard to tell this early on as well with Beedrill coming out, whether or not it'll be seeing too much play or not. One other card that I do want to quickly mention, which we haven't written down or anything, is the Eradicate, which I think's got a lot of potential. 60 damage for each special energy in your opponent's discard pile is very good. We were saying with Scizor, when we're talking about Scizor, that pretty much any deck now runs special energies. There are a few that don't. So I think this Eradicate could definitely be something that sees play in something like Vespiquen.
Yeah.
It's just a 1 energy attacker, and also the Rattata's very good. It's like, just get rid of a tool card on your opponent's active Pokemon. Get rid of like Spirit Links as well. Is like very strong first turn. So I think this Raticate could see some play in a couple of different decks as well. But that's pretty much it that really comes from Evolutions. Now the final thing we'll talk about is this event in London. This is the international. Is it an international championship? Is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Yep. So this is running from the 9th of December to the 11th of December, and you're going to this one, aren't you?
Yes, I should be. I haven't actually heard about the travel award yet, but as soon as
Okay.
that's,
Yeah.
I,
So was it like everybody who got APAC award gets,
only the top half actually, the top
Top
four of APAC.
and then the bottom 4 get like some like.
So it was the top four were get the travel award, and then everyone ranked from 5th down to 16th, I believe it was, getting the $1,000 stipend.
Okay, so it's still all right. It's not too bad. So
Yeah.
this is going to. I think this event's going to be huge. It's a 3-day long event, and it's the first international. So I think this event's going to be massive. There's going to be a lot of good players going to this one as well. Just being that first international is going to be incredible. It's going to be standard format. Evolution's legal. It'll definitely be an interesting event, and I think probably the best event to kind of dictate where the format is going as well. There is the regionals, which you mentioned to me earlier. That's going to be standard format, but that is pre-evolutions. So this London event is going to be huge. I assume Pokemon are probably going to stream this one as well.
Yeah, they've confirmed that it'll be a live stream.
Okay, yeah. So there will be a stream for that one as well. It'll be interesting to see. I hope you do well at it. 500 championship points straight away to start the year. Get your invite before the season even begins in Australia. Would be nice. Eh?
Yeah.
Alright, so we'll end the video there. Thank you guys for watching, and thank you, Jordan, for joining me today. It's been a very good video to make with you and talk about this tier list. Hopefully people who watch this can kind of gauge something about the format and going forward. So thank you for joining me. I assume you'll be posting on Ace Trainer about London if you go.
Yeah,
okay, so
definitely.
I'll leave a link to Ace Trainer below, so you can check updates there for London and probably report on all Australian players that go. I think there were a couple other players that I've seen discussing going to it. I think if you've got the money, you may as well go to it. So thank you for joining me today, and thank you everybody for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.